David Bowman. I am the tutoring coordinator with the BCSCR project through the Three Rivers Education Foundation. And if you're watching this video, there's a good chance that you're serving or you're interested in serving as a reading tutor through the BCSCR project. So for that, first I want to say thank you. What you're doing is very important. Not only are you helping students to improve their reading ability and their literacy outcomes, but by doing so, helping students to access the content in math and social studies, language arts, science, and so forth, and also become empowered citizens and empowered residents of their community. Reading is one of those absolutely fundamental skills that everyone needs in order to not only move forward in their education endeavors, but also move forward in their personal life goals, their expectations, their career goals, and so forth. So thank you, because what you're doing is very, very important. In this next few minutes, what we'll be doing is taking a look at the BCSCR reading instruction. Most importantly, we're going to be looking at the various components that make up effective reading, and we're going to look at what the research tells us about how do we help kids to acquire the skills that make up good reading. So we'll be looking at a number of things here. But first, I want to take a moment and share with you what the overall goal of the project is. As stated in the project proposal, in the project, what the goal is to demonstrably and sustainably improve children's literacy outcomes. Now, that's a lot of fancy language, but what it really means is we want more kids reading, and we want more kids reading well, and that's where you come in. So let's take a look at how the reading instruction is, the framework for the reading instruction, and also what we know about teaching reading. So first, looking at the structure of the tutoring program. The tutoring is guided by a number of pieces that you will use to make informed instructional decisions about the kids you work with. First, we have the pre and post assessment. We're using the iReady assessment to look at what student-specific skills are at the beginning of the program, and also to see what improvements they have made at the end. It's a pre-post test. But as importantly, you can use those pre-test results to get a better understanding of what can a particular child do and where does a particular child need to improve his or her skills. Then you can begin to make instructional decisions about what do you need to do for that individual child. Now, the nice thing about the BCSCR tutoring program is there's a maximum of 4 kids. Many of the strategies that we're going to talk about can be very difficult or at least challenging to implement at the classroom level. But when you only have 4 kids, it becomes much more doable. And the same thing is true here. When we talk about differentiating instruction for every single child, that can be a challenge to do if you've got 15, 20, 25 kids. But here you have 4 kids. So the expectation is very reasonable that you will be able to design the types of instructional opportunities and learning opportunities that each child needs. Now, along with the pre-post test, we also have what we call an ongoing standards-based assessment. Basically what it is, it's a rubric. For each grade level and each component of reading, we have identified a series of levels. 4 being the target level for a grade level, but also all of the preliminary levels that lead up to it. And it becomes very important for one reason. One of the mistakes that we often make when we talk about teaching kids to read is we're always trying to push kids to meet the grade level expectation. So regardless of where the child is, what the child can do, what the child knows, and so forth, we're always trying to teach those grade level skills. But the problem with that approach is that in many times a student doesn't have the necessary background information, the necessary conceptual understanding of fundamental skills in order to make sense of the grade level abilities. So when we use a rubric, we can identify at what particular level a child is, and instead of jumping all the way to the grade level expectation, we go to the next step, and just the next step. And by doing so, we help the child build those fundamental skills, build the conceptual understandings that eventually will get them to the grade level expectation. The third major piece of the tutoring approach is what we call a comprehensive and relevant instructional design. Comprehensive means we're going to address all of the areas of reading, all of the major components of reading. And relevant means that we're going to make sure the instruction is relevant or appropriate for a particular child. However, there's also another piece that when we talk about relevant that's important to understand. When we are looking at activities, when we're looking at reading materials and learning materials, we want to make sure that the materials that we choose are relevant to a particular child's interests. See, we're asking kids to do something very difficult here, and especially those kids that are already struggling reading. We're asking them to do the work necessary to improve their reading ability. But if we give them reading materials that don't have any interest to them, we don't give them any reason to do the necessary work. So one of the things that we encourage of tutors is that as you're selecting materials for kids to read, and you're going to select materials to use during reading instruction, let's make sure that those materials are relevant to an individual child's interest, because then the child will have some reason to go through the work necessary and do the work necessary to become a stronger reader. A child can learn to read just as well from one type of material as another. If a child is interested in automobiles, for example, we can look at texts and stories and nonfiction texts that deals with automobiles. The child is already interested in the content, so we can use that interest and find materials that are relevant to it. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot view of what the entire approach looks like. Now let's look a little bit more about at the reading components and the instruction, what we know about instruction. So the instructional component of BCSCR tutoring was designed first and foremost around the research and the strategies proposed by the Reading First Initiative and America Reads and a couple of other programs like that have looked very carefully at what it means to be a strong reader and what strong readers do. So what we find is that there are 6 major components of reading. Now some of them are probably obvious to you: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency. Then we also have vocabulary or comprehension in vocabulary, and comprehension strategies, which deal more with how do we get meaning out of text. But there's a 6th piece that we have added to the BCSCR tutoring structure, and that is oral language development. And I think you'll see that when we talk specifically about what oral language development means and how it relates to the other areas, you're going to see why we consider it to be a critical part of the overall instruction. All right, with that in mind, now let's take a look at each one of these 6 areas, what they are, what do we know about what people do when they're using those skills, and what we know about providing effective instruction in those particular areas. The first of which is phonemic awareness. So, phonemic awareness is very simple. It's the ability to receive sounds, receive words, and understand that it's made up of individual sounds. A student with strong phonemic awareness skills can pick out the individual sounds that make up a particular word. They're aware of the phoneme, so phonemic awareness. So for example, if we look at the word read, we have 3 major sounds there. We have for the beginning sound, we have E, the middle sound, and D for the final sound, read. It has 3 sounds. If we look at the word bed, a student with strong phonemic awareness can tell you that the first sound is B, as in bed. Now, when we're providing instruction in this, the key is to help students look at word groups. So we do that a couple different ways. But most important thing to know about teaching phonemic awareness is that it can be taught explicitly and it can be taught systematically. which means that we're going to start with just one or two phonemes at a time, and then we're going to manipulate them. For example, if we look at read, we can look at word groups like read, seed, feed, deed, lead, heed, bead, and probably some others that I can't think of. But there's a bunch. So by changing that initial sound, what we're doing is not focusing on R, B, and so on like that. We're looking at the E sound, which finishes the word, and we're manipulating that initial phoneme to help the child create the patterns, the mental patterns that allow it to access that final phoneme, the E sound. So if we think about how brains work relative to phonemic awareness, human brains are very good at one thing. They're very good at creating patterns. As a matter of fact, just about everything we do that our brain does is about creating patterns. How do we learn to speak in the first place, for example? If you think about an infant will make every single sound that is physiologically possible. Some sounds will receive a positive response from its caretakers. Some will receive no response, and some will receive a negative response or a punitive response. And over time, the child starts to associate particular sounds with that positive response. And it creates that pattern. It says, oh, if I make these sounds, then this is the response that I'm going to get. Right? It's a patterning behavior, and that's what the human brain does. So we use that in order to help children learn phonemic awareness. And that's where we start looking at those word groups, seed, feed, read, lead, bead, and so forth. Like that. We're establishing a pattern that allows children to pick out individual sounds within a word and then to manipulate them. So we make it very explicit, which means we have to pre-plan what sounds that we're going to help the child access, or what one or two sounds the child is going to access, and then we work on manipulating those sounds, manipulating those phonemes until that pattern begins to occur in the child's brain, and then we can move on to the next few. Okay, so what we know about instruction is very simple. We look at sound groups, and we help the children establish patterns. We're looking for mastery over particular sound groups before we move on to the next sound group or the next one or two phonemes to study. By doing it in this approach conscientiously, explicitly, systematically, one or two phonemes at a time, we can help a child become proficient in phonemic awareness. Now, why is that so important? Oh, and some people have asked, well, what about older kids? Because generally when we talk about instruction in phonemic awareness, we're talking about, pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, maybe third grade, maybe in some cases. But there are more advanced phonemes. If we start looking at diphthongs and silent letters and things like that, those are much more advanced levels in phonemic awareness. So we can't assume that just because a child is 5, 6, 7 years old, that they have mastered what there is to know about phonemic awareness. This is a skill which continues farther. Well, when we have a good grasp of phonemic awareness, we can then look at the other side of the coin, the other side of the phonemic process, which is the ability to decode written words into sounds, a process that we call phonics. So what phonics is the opposite of that, where we're looking at the letter symbols and we're converting those into sounds. Then we begin to pull the sounds together, combine them together, and say, is this a word that I know? So for example, if we look at the example of bead, very, very simple. So the child can look at the words on the page and say, that first one is ba, the next one is pronounced a schwa sound, and then da at the end. Ba, d. And they put them together and they say, does this sound combination resemble a word that I already know? And that's the process of phonics. Now, here's the problem that we've seen with a lot of phonics instruction. Phonics is great as long as the sound which is produced, the word which is produced, does in fact match something in the child's vocabulary. I can imagine cases where children can accurately produce the sound of a word, but still have no idea what that word means. So when we work on phonemic awareness, when we work on phonics with children, we also need to work on vocabulary, because at some point the child is going to produce the sound of the word and has to have some understanding of what that word means once it's been produced. So a couple of examples here, like bat and psycho. Psycho is actually an interesting one for phonemic awareness because it has all of those two-letter combinations that produce single sounds. The PS makes the sus sound, the CH makes a cuss sound, and so forth, which is pretty advanced actually. Again, like phonemic awareness, this type of instruction is often relegated to the lower grade levels, but that's not necessarily appropriate because there are much more advanced letter sound combinations than what a child would normally be using at such a low grade level. Another example is science, or the word I is actually a very interesting word because even though it's got 3 letters in it, 3 vowels if you count Y as a vowel, it only has 1 phoneme. So it's not E-ye, it's I, which is a single sound. Very interesting words actually. So what do we know about instruction around phonemic awareness? Obviously we're looking at letter-sound relationships. Okay, that's simply what phonemic awareness is. This letter combination produces that sound. But we also need to look at syllables within words because ultimately what we're getting to is not just individual discrete sounds, but the combination of those sounds. So if we look at individual letters, we can sometimes produce sound combinations that bear no resemblance to the word we're trying to produce. We have to be able to move from our early understanding of phonemic awareness into an understanding of syllables within words. So we're always looking for those syllable combinations and helping children to pick out syllables, letter combinations that produce single sounds. And we're going to do it, obviously we're going to take words, we're going to break them into those syllables, we're going to learn how those particular syllables are pronounced, we're going to combine them back together, and then we're going to compare them to a word that's already in our working vocabulary. Now, some things that we have learned. Obviously, as you can tell, we need to tie this with phonemic awareness. It really is just the other side of phonemic awareness, going from words, spoken words, into individual sounds. Now we're going to go from letters into individual sounds, which we then combine together into words. So it has to be tied with phonemic awareness. All phonics should be combined with phonemic awareness, but as I've been saying, it also needs to be tied with vocabulary instruction because the child has to know what the word means once it's been produced. So that's phonics. Now let's take a look at the next major component, fluency. Fluency is very simply the ability to read text aloud at a normal rate and pace, and be able to produce the sounds accurately. Now interestingly, if you listen to advanced readers reading aloud, they're going to skip words. They're going to mispronounce words. It just happens. There are very few people that can 100% take a piece of text and read it out loud, especially now without any kind of practice. So even though we're looking at producing the text at a reading aloud at a normal rate and a high degree of accuracy, we really shouldn't try to push kids to have 100% accuracy because even the strongest readers rarely attain that level. What we're really trying to get to here is, does the child understand what he or she is reading aloud? So kids that don't have good fluency skills when they're reading can fall into 2 camps. On one side, we have the kids that pick out individual words, pause, they think about the next word and they say it, they think about the next word and they say it, and they so on like that. And you end up with this very broken speech pattern. So the child makes it through a passage, and it's usually pretty painful to listen to a child try to read that way. It's a necessary step, but it can be a bit cumbersome. But then the point is, you ask the child afterwards, what did you read? And there's a very good chance that a child who reads aloud that way cannot tell you what he or she has just read. The problem is, the child is focusing so hard on individual words that they never get a chance to think about how those words string together into some kind of a meaningful whole. They're focusing on the words and not what the words mean and how those words interact. Now on the flip side of that, we have kids that just read too fast, just right through it. And they're pretty much doing the exact same thing. Their focus is so much on producing those words and producing them quickly and showing you how well they can do this, reading aloud, that their focus is entirely on producing the sounds of the words and not on the meaning of the words when they're combined together into sentences and paragraphs and so forth. So in both cases, the ones who pick through the words too slowly and the ones who just blurt them out too quickly, very often those kids are not going to be able to understand or not understand well what it is that they have read. And that's why we want to emphasize the natural, sort of normal speaking pace when we're reading aloud. So there's a couple of things we know about how do we help kids do this. And the number one strategy, bar none, is the strategy called guided oral reading. And guided oral reading is very simple. You're reading aloud, and the child is reading it back to you. And then you're correcting the child if they can't pronounce particular words and so on, and maybe you do it again. You read it, they read it. You read it, they read it. You read it, they read it. Back and forth like this until the child becomes adept at a particular passage and can do it out loud at a normal tone and a normal pace and understand what it's reading. My only caution is don't stick with the same passage too long, because we want the kids to be interpreting the words off the page and not just memorizing the passage and ignoring what's on the page. We do want the child to actually be reading when he or she is engaged in this strategy of guided oral reading. Now, it can also be done a couple of other ways. You might have heard of the term choral reading, where you have several kids together, 2, 4, 10 kids together, who are reading the same passage and they're reading it out loud, and they practice reading it out loud so that they are all on the same rate and the same pace and are producing the text synonymously at the same time as one another. So that also works, and you can even have kids do this strategy for each other. One reads it aloud, the other one repeats it. Then the second child reads the passage and the first one repeats it, and back and forth like that. Those also work. However, the primary and the most effective way to use guided oral reading is for you, the tutor, to read the passage and have the child read it back. Now, obviously, for a child that has fluency problems, you're not going to choose a very long passage. You're going to choose kind of a short passage. Same thing with younger kids. It might only be 1 or 2 sentences. With older kids, maybe it's a whole paragraph. You really have to kind of think about the individual child and what the appropriate complexity of the text is and the appropriate length of the text. Another piece of advice to go along with guided oral reading and helping children to develop fluency is make sure it's something that the child is interested in. The text has to be meaningful, and that means not only does it have to have valuable content, but it has to have content which reflects the child's interest. Now, think about this for a couple of reasons. I mentioned earlier that we're asking a lot of these kids. We're really asking them to work hard to develop these skills. So we want to give them a reason to do so by giving them interesting text. But also, if we give them text which is meaningful to them and falls within their areas of interest, they're more likely to know what those words are. If we give them something which is outside of their context, maybe they can produce it, but they're never going to attain understanding because they don't know what the words mean. And especially if they don't know what the words mean, they're going to stop, they're going to have to think about that individual word, which is never going to get them to the point where they're understanding the entire passage. So meaningful text. Now obviously, in regards to that, this has to be balanced with vocabulary instruction. We want them to produce the words at a normal pace, we want them to know what they're about, but they have to know what those words mean. So we also provide vocabulary instruction along with fluency instruction. And of course, phonics has to be included with this. This is one of those things that when we teach phonics, we need to teach fluency. When we teach fluency, we need to teach phonics. Because we're asking kids to decode the words as they're reading along, and that's phonics. We also want to combine it with comprehension strategies, because what this is, it's an indicator of a child's readiness or potential for understanding the text. So after a child reads a piece, what are we going to do? We're going to ask, what do you think this is about? Can you tell me in your own words? What do you think this means? How might you use this information? Is this like something you have read before, and so on and so forth? So we're going to start asking those questions that help to gauge the child's level of comprehension. And finally, oral language development. And I don't want to say too much about that until we actually get to that piece, but the primary question that we're asking here around oral language development is, what do you think this writer is trying to communicate? What does this information mean not only to you, but to the writer who wrote it? But we'll talk more about oral language development when we get to that point. So again, the number one strategy is guided oral reading, which may take a couple different forms. The best form is, of course, you're reading, the child's repeating it back and forth like that. Children can do it for each other, and we can also engage in choral reading as well. All right, so that's fluency. Now let's move to the fourth skill. It's a comprehension skill, vocabulary. Vocabulary is actually pretty interesting, and fortunately, most teachers are getting away from the days where you give the kids a list of 10 words. These are our words for the week. Write 5 sentences, and at the end of the week, I'm going to give you a quiz. Next week, we're going to have another 10 words, and we're going to ignore the ones that we did this week because we've got 10 more words to focus on. Okay. That is really crummy vocabulary instruction if it's used by itself. I mean, if that's the basis of vocabulary development and that's all that it is, then children are never going to develop the robust vocabulary that they need in order to be literate in multiple contexts and multiple situations. So what is vocabulary, first of all? Vocabulary means decoding a word, comparing it to a word that the child already knows, and then being able to use and understand that word correctly within a particular context, whether it's an oral context or a written context. What does that word mean here in its usage at this point? So that's what's happening during vocabulary. That's what it is. All right, so when a child encounters a new word, something very interesting happens, and not just a child, but really when any reader encounters a new word, here's what happens. First, the word is decoded. It's sounded out, and the reader then says, is this a word that I already know? Okay, and if it is, then they can say, okay, how does my understanding of what this word means apply to this particular situation? Do I need to modify my understanding? Is it being used in a different way in this particular case? But what does that word mean here? Okay, but let's say that the decoding doesn't work. You know, you can produce the word, but you still don't know what it's meaning in that particular situation. So we go to the next level, which is a process of discovery. Because there's two ways to approach new words. We have decoding, which we just talked about, and discovery. So if decoding doesn't work, we move on to discovery. And discovery is a set of processes that can be taught to a child. It begins with looking at word parts. All right, so I look at this word, I don't know what it means. Are there any parts of this word that I do understand? You know, does it have a prefix that I understand? Does it have a suffix that I understand? Is there a root? Is there some part of this word, as I analyze it, that will allow me to understand what it means here? Okay, and if that doesn't work, then we look at context clues. Are there any other words around this word in this passage that would give me some idea of what it means here? And if that fails, well, then we just go out and we look it up. We look for it online, we look for it in our dictionary, we actually just go out, or we ask somebody, hey, what does this word mean? We get external information about the word. And then we put the process in place backwards. So at every step, we're either going to a more advanced skill and then moving backwards through the skills we've already tried. Well, I mean, that's what we're doing. I mean, that really is it. So if decoding works, we decode it, we apply it to the context. If word parts, word analysis works, we try to get an understanding, we see how it applies to the context. If we're looking at context clues that give us some idea, then after we look at the context clues, then we're looking and say, okay, if I think I know what it means in this context based on these other words around it, are there some parts in the word that reflect that understanding, and then how does it apply to this context? And if we have to go out to an external source and get just a definition of what this word means, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take that definition, then we're going to apply it to the context, then we're going to look at the word parts, and then we're going to put it into the passage and say, now, what do I think it means in this situation? So we're either, when we move to more advanced skills, interestingly what happens is then we reverse the process at each step until we get back to the word within the passage. So decoding, word analysis, context clues, external sources. If we go to external sources, we then put it in the context, look for the context clues to clarify our understanding. Then we look at the word parts, and then we piece it back together and put it in the passage and say, now does it still make sense? So that's what's happening when we encounter new words, and good readers do this, and the role of the reading instructor is then to help the child, help the student understand these various skills: decoding, word analysis, context clues, external sources, and then backwards. So that's the first thing that we do when we're talking about vocabulary. We're helping the child learn these different skills. We can do this a couple of different ways. So vocabulary instruction can be either incidental or direct. Incidental means we're reading something and, oh, we found a word that we don't know. So we apply these strategies. Direct instruction is when we predetermine what words we're going to study, and we help the kids to master those words. This is where that whole 10 words a week thing came into place. You know, here are 10 words, it's direct instruction, let's go figure out what they mean. Okay. But like I mentioned, if we stop there, then the instruction will never be effective. Yeah, the kid might remember it long enough to take the quiz at the end of the week or so, but they may not be able to use those words appropriately in other contexts or even remember what those words mean. So we can go two ways. We find words and we study them, or we predetermine what the words are going to be and we study them. The key strategy for developing a stronger, or helping kids to develop a stronger vocabulary, so the key instructional strategy is to select meaningful text, determine what words within that text are going to be problematic and need to be studied, and then to study those words prior to reading them in the context of the passage. Because here's what we want to have happen. Ultimately, here's how we develop a strong vocabulary. And I need to refer back to that patterning behavior of the human brain. We decide what words we're going to teach. We use them, we read those words within a particular meaningful passage, meaningful text, and then we keep using those words and keep using them and keep using them. We're finding those words over and over again in the text that we read. We're using them as we're speaking to a student. We're pointing out how those words are used in multiple contexts. So we just keep using those same words over and over again, and the student's brain begins to build a pattern that says, aha, here is what this word means. Here's what this word means, and here are the different ways that that word can be used, and when it's appropriate, and when it's meaningful. And if I'm hearing that word, I can then interpret and say, aha, in this case, this is what it means. I read it, this is what it means here. So we help the children to develop those patterns, those mental patterns, that not only allow them to build up more words in their vocabulary, but also use those words flexibly in multiple contexts. So that's where the typical vocabulary instruction seems to fall short. We study the words, we move on. You know, write your 10 sentences or your 5 sentences and then move on. But we need to keep using those words with the children so that their brains have the chance to develop those patterns that allow them to understand not only what those words means, but all the different ways those words can be used in multiple contexts. So when we talk about restructuring and repeated exposure, that's what we're talking about. using those same target words multiple times and in multiple contexts. And after we've studied them, do we stop using those words? No, of course not. We keep on using them because now the child knows what they mean. I mean, the great thing about words is that we can use them to express concepts and ideas. We can use them to communicate. So once the child understands what those words means, we suddenly have a better ability to communicate with that child, and the child has a better ability to communicate with us. So yes, we're absolutely going to keep using those words over and over again. So to recap, what do we know about vocabulary instruction? Study the words first, read them in text, and then use them repeatedly in activities and in our instruction. The second piece is we have to balance this with those learning strategies, the decoding, word analysis, where we pick it apart, context clues, and then how to access external information and determine the appropriateness of that external information. Now finally, this takes us to comprehension. Obviously, when we're talking, just to back up, when we're talking about vocabulary, it has to be combined with phonics because they have to be able to decode the words. It has to be combined to a certain degree with phonemic awareness because we need to be able to break words apart, to look at the word clues, the clues within the word, like the prefixes and the suffixes and the affixes and things like that. But we also balance it with comprehension and with fluency. That's one of those skills that cuts across all of these other areas. So we're never going to teach vocabulary discretely. All right. So having said that, now let's look a little bit more closely at comprehension. What do we mean by comprehension, and what do we know about helping kids to develop strong comprehension? So basically what comprehension means is constructing a meaning through interacting with text. Because think about what happens. You read something and it means something to you. You hear something and it means something to you. A different person reads it or hears it and it means perhaps something different to that person because you are interacting with that text. You're interacting with those words and you're interpreting them according to your own understandings. So here's what happens. You read a text, you interpret it according to your schema, your background, your philosophy, your experiences, the way you've heard those words used before, what you know about the author, or what you know about the context, your background knowledge. All of this comes together to help you interpret and make meaning of the text that you're reading. Now, interestingly, one of the mistakes that we often make when we're asking kids to tell us what they think a passage means, what does this mean to you? How do you interpret this? What do you think the author means? So on like that. We assume that there's only one answer. And that's almost never the case. Because think about what's happening. Each person is interpreting the text according to his, her, or her own schema. So if the child comes up with an understanding or says this means this or this means that, and it's not what you expect, the first question to ask is, why do you think it means that? Now sometimes the child doesn't understand the passage, or they've missed pieces of it, or they don't understand the words, so they just flat out don't understand what the passage means because they haven't been able to understand the passage accurately or thoroughly enough. But sometimes the child will say it means blank, it means X, and can tell you why, and from that perspective, from that interpretation, in fact, it does mean what the child says it means. Because that child is bringing his or her own schema to the interpretation of the text that he's interacting with. So we ask, why does it mean that to you? And if we find out that there's just missing information, the child didn't read all of it or didn't understand a piece of it and so on, that gives us, the instructor, some clues that we need in order to say, okay, let's take another look at the text and show me why you think it means that. But what about this part over here? Did you understand this, and how does that change what you think it means? And what about these words over here? Do you understand what these words mean? What do these words mean in this context? Does that change what you think this passage means? So instead of taking a punitive approach where we say, that's not right, it means something else, we take an instructional approach and we help the child use skills and use strategies to develop a fuller understanding of the text. And like I said, sometimes the child thinks it means something that you're not expecting, and the child can be right. All right, what is the number one strategy for developing comprehension? This is something that strong readers do and weak readers do not do. And that is what we call comprehension self-monitoring. That means you as the reader, or the child as the reader, at every moment asking himself, do I understand what I'm reading? And if the answer is yes, great, hurrah. Do I understand? The next question is, why do I think it means this? Okay, but if we come to the point where we say, I really don't understand what this particular passage means, then we know that we have to do some work necessary to reach understanding. So strong readers do this. They're always asking, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? Do I understand what this means? And if they don't understand, if the answer is no, then they study it and they examine it and they read it more carefully and they think about it. And there's lots of things they do. What weak readers tend to do is just keep going. So if they don't understand it, they don't ever stop and say, I don't understand, so I need to study it, and they just keep going, and then they never gain understanding. I mean, we've seen this so many times. A child reads something, I'm finished reading, right? And then you know, a story or a book or a passage or something. I'm done reading, and they think they've accomplished something. And we've kind of misled kids into thinking that if you get all the way through it, then you've done reading. But you really haven't if you don't understand it. So we have to help kids to develop that habit, that mental habit of always asking, do I understand what I'm reading? And if I don't, then I need to stop and figure out what this means. So that's the main thing. So some ways that we can do this, there's lots of cooperative learning strategies that we can apply. Kids working together, trying to interpret text and so forth. You can look online or use your own knowledge and background, of course. But cooperative strategies around developing comprehension are particularly effective. That's a couple or more kids working together where each one has a meaningful role within the process, and each one is responsible not only for the outcome of their group learning, but also are able to demonstrate those skills individually. So really, if we think about what cooperative learning is, it's three things. Everybody has a meaningful role. Everybody is responsible for producing some kind of an outcome together, and every person has the responsibility for being able to individually produce those skills or demonstrate those skills. So cooperative learning, not just kids working together around the same table and so forth. Also very useful for helping kids to develop comprehension is the use of graphic organizers. We've all seen the webs. Here's the character's name and hair color, family, job, pets, habits, interests, things like that. Some kind of a web to help the child organize the information. But there's lots of different ways to do this. There's flow charts, there's Gantt charts, there's these different kinds of webs, there's cause and effect diagrams. There's lots of different types of graphic organizers. And they're particularly effective because what we're teaching kids to do is to organize the information and being able to show how that information connects to other information. How do the parts interact with one another? So we use these graphic organizers to do this, and over time we learn to do them mentally, to create those same kinds of structures and same organizational patterns in our own heads. And there's that word patterning again, because that's what our brain is trying to do, and that's what we're teaching the brain to do, is create those patterns, first visually and then internally. So I said the first thing we teach, the most important strategy, is that comprehension self-monitoring. But as far as what we do instructionally, there is one strategy that exceeds every other strategy for helping kids to develop comprehension. That strategy is to engage the child, engage the student in meaningful discussions about the text using higher level questioning. Not just who did this, who did that, what was this person's name, what happened when this person did that, but we start looking at Bloom's taxonomy and we start looking at those more advanced levels of questioning. Why do you think this happened? What would happen if this were different? Tell me how this person's expectation agreed with the outcomes. What would you have done differently here? Did this person, this character do the right thing? So that some fiction examples or some literary examples. If you think about nonfiction examples, where might you use this information? Do you think that this is a good process? Do you think this information is accurate? Right? How are there other texts or other information which support what's being read about in here? Are there some that are contrary? So we start asking those more advanced questions so the child can interact more and more and more deeply with the content that's in the passage that we give them to read. So above every other strategy for developing comprehension, engaging the children in higher level questioning, or higher level discussions. So take a look at Bloom's taxonomy. If this isn't, if you're trying to think, well, what are these questions and what are these higher levels and so forth, look at Bloom's taxonomy. If you have a copy of the tutor manual, there's a copy of it in the back. But really, you can look anywhere online, just Bloom's taxonomy, and you're going to find a gazillion sites that will tell you what's in it, and give you question clues, and give you types of prompts and responses that reflect different levels. What you really want to find from an instructional standpoint is what question words reflect different levels. So for example, who as a question word is will generate a very low level question. What will generate a low to medium level question. Analyze will produce a higher level. Evaluate will produce a higher level. Compare is a higher level. Contrast is a higher level. So that's what you're looking for. And you're engaging the kids, meaningful text, and you're engaging kids in discussions that use those higher level questions. There's nothing more successful for helping kids to develop comprehension than that. And think about it. If you're going to ask those kinds of questions and have kids answer them, they have to think very carefully about what they've read. And they have to be able to support what they've read. I mean, we've all seen these passages. You read something and you say, okay, now defend your answer, right? Why do you think it means that? Point, what information led you to that conclusion, okay? And when we engage in these conversations, these discussions, that's what we're asking kids to do. So they have to interact very deeply and very intimately with the text that we have them read. So really, and it's not rocket science. It doesn't take specialized materials. It doesn't take specialized, reading programs or anything like that. It's you and the kids talking about what they're reading. And that's as difficult as it is. Now, in a large classroom, this can be a bit hard to do, because you got a lot of kids, right? So, but you can ask this kid over here, you can talk to that kid over there, and the other ones are, engaging. We make sure, of course, that every kid has a chance to engage in some of those higher level answers. But it becomes very easy when we have a small group. And the nice thing about the BCSCR tutoring structure is you have 4 kids. And that is an optimal environment for having those kinds of discussions. As a matter of fact, with BCSCR, we've set some parameters around group size. No fewer than 3, no more than 4. And one of the main reasons is because that's the range at which you can engage in these discussions meaningfully. This is in part why one-on-one tutoring is never going to be as effective for reading as 1-on-3 or 1-on-4. When we talked about cooperative learning strategies are very effective, well, you've got to have kids to cooperate, so you've got to have more than one kid to do that. And when we're engaging in discussions, it can be very awkward and stilted if it's just 2 people, but If we have more than two, we got 3 or 4 kids, this one can respond to that one. And that one can respond to that one. And they can begin to generate those discussions amongst themselves. You can't do that with one-on-one. You really can't even do it very well with 2-on-1. But in a group size of 3 or 4, it becomes very, very powerful. So, what have we learned? Obviously, graphic organizers. We're asking kids to read, reflect, summarize, discuss, study words, and we'll use pre-planned or carefully selected discussions, questions to guide discussions about the text. Not rocket science, but very, very powerful. Now, let's talk about the final level. So I mentioned that oral language development is very often not included in reading instruction, but it needs to be. When we think about reading, we often think about the highest level of reading, the pinnacle of all of our instruction. What are we trying to do? Comprehension, understanding the text. But there's a very subtle skill which is necessary for true comprehension to take place. And it's very advanced, and it's called oral language development. Now, often when we think about oral language development, it's simply, somebody speaks, what does that person mean? Can you generate a response that means what you're trying to say? Okay, that's very low-level oral language development. But oral language development truly is a more sophisticated skill, and not just what does that mean to you, or what are you trying to say, but it's are you saying, and are you writing, and are you communicating something in a manner which is going to be accessible to the other person? And when you receive information from another person, whether through spoken word or through text, what does it mean to the person that generated that information? So I read something, and I try to ask comprehension, what does it mean to me? But oral language development, I ask the question, what does it mean to the person writing it? Because as I mentioned, oftentimes we can read the same thing, and we can hear the same thing, and we can respond very differently to it because it means something different to us. But the highest level skill, and this is truly a communication skill above and beyond just reading, what does it mean to the person who generated that information, the person who wrote it, the person who said it? If I can interpret that, what that person means, then I can say, all right, now what does it mean to me? And we can actually engage in real communication because I am understanding the other person. I mean, really, what is reading? If we think about what reading is a skill for communication. It's a vehicle for communicating between a person who writes and a person who reads. And we cannot have true communication unless at some point we can say, what does this mean to the person who originated the information, to the person who wrote it, the person who's speaking it. And that is a very powerful skill. So, oral language development, where do we normally teach it? Pre-K, K, 1, 2, 3, maybe, and then it seems to just disappear. But it is a sophisticated skill that we develop over the course of a lifetime at every age. So when we're talking about comprehension strategies, and this is where we really develop oral language development, when we talk about comprehension strategies, we're always asking the question, what does it mean to the person who wrote it? Why is this person communicating this information? What does this person want you to know? Are there any messages within this text which are not discreetly written out? What else is happening? We often talk about reading between the lines, right? Or, well, he says this, but I know he means something else. Well, what we're describing there is oral language development. If we think about satire with kids, oftentimes in high school we have kids read satire. What is this person trying to actually say, right? That's oral language development. So we strengthen our oral language development through the discussions that we have, the higher level discussions that we have when we're working on comprehension. Those discussions are the key vehicle for helping kids to develop oral language development, bar none. So just briefly, what does it look like to develop oral language development? We have exposure to language. We practice using it in various settings, always questioning our interpretation. Does it really mean that? Is it supposed to mean that? And so forth. And then we use those skills and see what kind of a response that we get. It's that patterning behavior. Little kids do when they make sounds. What kind of a response do they get? That is the beginning of oral language development, right? Do they get a frown? Or do they get smiles, right? Do they want the ball but they get the spoon instead? Okay, we're beginning to develop how we use language in a particular context and what kind of response we get. At a much higher level, we're looking at the other end. What is this person saying? What is this person meaning? Even if the actual words do not convey that message. All right. So we've talked about the instruction, which is higher level discussion in Bloom's taxonomy, right? Around text, around topics. And that's really what we know about reading instruction. Those are the components. That's what good readers do when they're using those skills. That's what good instructors do to help kids learn those skills. And that fundamentally is your job as a tutor. We want kids to show advancement in every one of these areas. So the instruction needs to make sure that we're employing what we know of best strategies and best practices to help to develop all of those areas. And we've also talked quite a bit about how those various skills interact, that we cannot teach these discretely. You know, this isn't vocabulary day, this is comprehension phonics vocabulary day. This isn't comprehension skills day, this is also vocabulary and fluency, right? So when we design the instructional opportunities, when we design the learning opportunities, we can think about how the various skills are interacting, because we're going to be teaching more than one skill at a time. So some things that are available to you. So let's just talk for a moment about what we've given you. So obviously this is a lot of information. Most all of this is in the tutor's manual, but there's a couple of other things there for you also. For example, in some pages, we have actual activities that help you to use these skills. You're going to find charts that say this particular skill set, this particular grade level, here are some strategies that seem to be effective. You know, and age appropriate, developmentally appropriate. There's also lists of online resources. You know, if you're looking for specific lessons, you can find them online, you know, lessons for phonics and so forth. I would only caution you, though, that if you're going to be finding external resources, external lessons online and so on like that, you have to be aware that the people who create those lessons aren't necessarily effective reading instructors, right? I mean, where's the evidence that they are? So you have to really be careful about what you use online and so forth, and weigh it against what we know about reading. Does this reflect what we know about best practices in teaching reading? So always have to ask ourselves that. It's kind of like what we ask kids. Does this make sense, right? Does it make sense? There's also a copy of Bloom's taxonomy in there. There's a summary of the National Reading Panel and their research into reading instruction. So there's a handful of things in there. But really, if you are employing proven strategies and helping kids to address each of those reading areas, then what we're going to find is that kids are going to make significant and demonstrable improvements in their reading. We're going to end up with what our main target is, which is more kids reading well. So there's a little bit more information available to you in there about the assessment and so forth. But really, that's what we know about reading, and that's what we're trying to do with BCSCR tutoring. So when I ran a similar program years back, we had about the same number of kids as we have through BCSCR. We had the kids across about the same geographic region. It was a very similar program, and this BCSCR tutoring was modeled after that one. So what did we find? At the end of the day, I told the tutors the exact same things about reading that I'm telling you now, and they implemented them in their tutoring sessions. So what happened? What were the results? Did it actually work? Because obviously, if it doesn't work, let's not do it, or let's do something different, or let's figure out why. Did it work? Well, the answer is definitively yes, it did. What we found is that in a 3-month period, children on average made a 1.4 grade level gain using an assessment which is statistically equal to the iReady assessment. We found a 1.4 grade level gain in only 3 months. Now the BCS, which was 3 months, anyway, however many hours. With the BCSCR tutoring, we actually have a longer time period. So we should see even better gains. But even if our gains are equivalent, generating a 1.4 grade level increase over a 4-month period is a very strong positive. And now think about what that does to the child. When children can't read or can't read well, they're going to struggle in math, science, language arts, social studies, all these different areas, because they can't understand the text, they can't understand the content. What does that do to a child's psyche, right? What does that make the child feel about himself? On the emotional side. On the academic side, how is the child ever going to be expected to succeed academically if they can't even understand the materials that they're supposed to be learning from? So by implementing these tutoring strategies, we truly do give kids a chance not only to be successful academically, but also to feel good about themselves, which is very important as well, and to feel good about reading, and to feel good about themselves as learners, and to say, you know what, with these skills, I can pretty much do anything I want in life. Thank you for teaching them to me. And really, that's my final message to you as the tutors. Thank you for the work that you're going to be doing on behalf of these children, and best wishes to you.